There are moments when someone you've watched for decades suddenly looks different. Not older in the way time usually moves across a face. Not tired in the way a long week might show. Different in a way that reaches you before you can explain it, before you can put words around what you're actually seeing. You notice it, and then you can't stop noticing it. That's a particular kind of feeling. It sits with you. Keith Urban has been a constant presence for a very long time, the guitar that seemed like an extension of his own body. The voice that carried something warm and honest inside every note. The energy on stage that never appeared to fade, no matter how many years passed, no matter how many shows came and went. Watching him perform felt like watching someone who had discovered, early and with complete certainty, the exact place they were meant to be, and who had simply decided to stay there. Forever if possible, but something shifted, something real and visible and quietly unsettling if you knew where to look. People noticed it first in photographs, then in video clips. Then in the way he carried himself through a room, the way he stood at a microphone, the way his face seemed to be carrying something that his words hadn't yet found a way to say. Fans who had followed him for 20 years, people who knew his expressions almost as well as their own, began asking questions they didn't quite know how to shape. They left careful comments. They opened threads in quiet corners of the internet and typed out long, considered observations, trying to name what they were seeing without being unkind about it. Some people brushed the whole thing aside. Others couldn't let it go and wouldn't because it felt too personal to ignore. This wasn't the usual noise that swirls around someone famous. This was different in tone, quieter, more genuinely concerned. More like the feeling you get when someone you care about shows up one day and something in their face has changed, and you don't want to say anything directly. But you also can't pretend you didn't see it. What is actually happening with Keith Urban? Is it something physical, something emotional? Is it the natural and honest passage of time, working its way across a man who spent decades burning brightly under stage lights? Or is there something deeper underneath all of it, something that explains not just how he looks now but how he seems in a fuller and more complicated sense? That question deserves a real answer. A patient one, a careful one. Keith Urban grew up on the far edge of the world, in a small Queensland town in Australia, where country music wasn't exactly the soundtrack of everyday life, but somehow became his entire language before he was old enough to fully understand why. He didn't just like music the way children like things they discover and then set aside. He needed it. His father ran a convenience store and kept country records spinning in the background throughout the day. Conway Twitty and Merle Haggard and Charlie Pride filling the air between customers and quiet afternoons, and young Keith absorbed every note with the intensity of someone who already understood. Somewhere deep and wordless that this was going to be his life. He picked up a guitar before most children his age had settled on a favorite sport. By the time he was a teenager, he wasn't playing for fun anymore. He was playing with intention, with direction, with the kind of seriousness that usually only comes much later. That kind of early devotion reshapes a person from the inside. It creates a relationship between the art and the self that isn't easily separated, maybe never separated at all. For Keith, music wasn't a path he chose the way you choose a direction at a crossroads. It was the thing that chose him, quietly and completely, and he spent the better part of his childhood simply following where it led. Trusting it the way you trust something that has never once let you down. He moved to Nashville in the early 1990s, a young Australian with an accent that stood out and a talent that could not be dismissed. The city wasn't immediately welcoming. Nashville in that era had its own rhythms, its own sense of who belonged and who didn't. Its own unspoken rules about what country music was supposed to sound like and where it was supposed to come from. Keith didn't fit neatly into any of those categories. For a while that worked against him quietly but consistently, but he kept playing, he kept writing. He stayed close to the music even during the stretches when the music didn't seem to be returning the investment he was making in it. He waited, and he worked, and eventually the city began to listen. The success, when it finally came, arrived slowly at first, and then all at once in the way success sometimes does. His American debut album arrived in 1999, and something in the industry shifted toward him. By the early 2000s, awards were coming and stadiums were filling. He married Nicole Kidman in 2006, and that union placed him inside a spotlight far wider and more intense than country music alone would ever have created. He became something larger than an artist at that point. He became a public figure in a broader sense, photographed at every occasion, discussed in rooms he wasn't present in. Held up as a symbol of romantic stability by people who had followed both their careers from a distance. And for years, he carried all of that visibility with what appeared to be genuine ease. He smiled on red carpets in a way that didn't look practiced. He performed with the same open joy he must have had as a kid in Queensland, standing in his father's store, hearing music for the first time. He showed up for his fans with a warmth that felt real rather than manufactured, the kind of warmth that can't be faked across 20 years without someone eventually noticing the difference. That image, the warm and open and endlessly energized Keith Urban, is exactly what makes the recent change feel so striking, because something has clearly moved. And the people who love him most have noticed it first. For most of his peak years, Keith Urban carried a specific and recognizable kind of physical presence. He was lean, yes, but the leanness was never the thing you noticed first. What you noticed was the vitality, the sense that energy was moving through him even when he was standing still. His hair, long and layered and sun-streaked, became nearly as iconic as the guitar he rarely put down. He moved across stages with an ease that looked completely natural, but was obviously the result of thousands of hours of practice compressed into something that felt more like instinct than effort. Audiences fell in love with more than the music. They fell in love with him as a person, or at least the version of him that public life made visible. He was honest about struggle in a way that felt rare for someone with his level of fame and success. He spoke openly about his early battles with addiction, not in the careful, polished language of a publicist's statement, but in the direct and unguarded way of someone who had actually lived through it and come out the other side. He didn't shelter himself behind the mythology that fame tends to build around people. He stood in front of his own story and let people see it clearly. That kind of transparency builds something between a performer and their audience that is different from ordinary admiration. It builds trust. Real trust, the kind that takes a long time to earn, and that makes any visible change in a person feel unexpectedly personal to those watching from the outside. His life with Nicole Kidman reinforced that perception. Here was a man who had survived real darkness, who had reinvented himself across continents, who had navigated the particular pressures of enormous fame, and who had somehow built something that looked, from any honest angle, like genuine happiness. 2 daughters, a home that seemed to be a home in the truest sense, a career that kept evolving without ever losing the thing that made it meaningful in the first place. For a long time, Keith Urban seemed like someone who had genuinely found his footing. And that is exactly what makes the shift, the one people have been quietly noticing, feel heavier than it might otherwise, because it wasn't just an image that changed. It was someone who had been, for many people, a quiet and unspoken kind of comfort, and now that comfort was asking a question it hadn't asked before. It began the way so many things begin now, with a photograph, not a staged one, not a carefully lit promotional image designed to present a particular version of someone. Just a candid picture, the kind that surfaces from an event or a public appearance and gets passed around before anyone has thought too hard about what they're looking at. But this one stopped people mid-scroll. Not because it was shocking or dramatic, but because Keith Urban in that image looked noticeably different from the Keith Urban that 20 years of photographs had established in people's minds. The face was sharper, the features more pronounced. The overall quality of the image was of a man who had changed in some way that the camera was capturing before language had caught up to explain it. It was the kind of difference that registers emotionally before it registers intellectually. Social media moved quickly, the way it always does. Fans placed older photographs beside newer ones and studied the differences with a care that was, in its own strange way, an expression of love. Some comments were gentle and genuinely worried. Others were harsher, the way internet spaces become harsh when people forget that the subject of their observations is an actual human being with an actual life. But underneath all the noise, a real question was forming, and it kept forming, and it didn't go away. What had changed? Some people offered weight loss as the explanation and pointed to the demanding physical nature of life on the road. Others suggested that what they were seeing was simply the natural and sometimes accelerated process of aging in someone who had spent decades under the particular pressures of public performance. A few raised the possibility of cosmetic procedures, noting structural changes in the face that seemed to go beyond what time alone might account for. These observations were made carefully by some people, and carelessly by others, the way all sensitive observations tend to be handled differently depending on who is making them and why. What stood out in the end was not the speculation itself but the tone underneath it. Because the people expressing concern were not, for the most part, critics or journalists looking for a story. They were fans, long-time, genuine, deeply invested fans who were worried, and worry is a fundamentally different thing from criticism. It comes from somewhere else entirely. It comes from caring. Keith Urban, for his part, continued to show up. He kept performing. He kept honoring his commitments. He kept being, as far as the world could observe, present. He didn't address any of it publicly, at least not in the way that might have quieted the conversation. And so the questions stayed alive, circling quietly without finding anywhere to land. To truly understand what people were responding to, it helps to step back from the photographs for a moment and think about what his actual life looks like from the inside. Not from the perspective of the stage, where everything is lit and intentional and designed to project energy outward, but from the perspective of the life being lived offstage, in the spaces between performances, in the years accumulated one demanding tour at a time. Performing at Keith Urban's level is not a gentle occupation. It is a sustained physical and psychological commitment that most people never encounter and can be difficult to fully imagine. Artists at his tier may spend more than half of any given year away from home, moving through the interchangeable world of tour buses, airports, hotel rooms, green rooms, and stages that begin to blur into one long, continuous experience of being somewhere that is never quite home. The body learns to adapt to strange hours and irregular rhythms. Sleep becomes something you negotiate rather than something you simply do. Nutrition becomes whatever is available in the window between sound check and the moment the lights come up. This is not a complaint about the life. Most artists at this level chose it freely and would choose it again without hesitation. But the cumulative effect of spending decades inside that particular machine is real and physical and eventually visible, because the body is not separate from the life being lived inside it. It registers everything, it keeps its own account, and then there is the emotional weight that runs alongside all of it. Keith has spoken at various moments across his career about the internal discipline required to maintain his sobriety inside an industry, and a lifestyle that creates constant opportunities for the opposite. The therapy he has engaged with. The conscious and daily effort required to remain grounded in a life that pulls persistently toward noise and excess, and the specific kind of unreality that fame tends to generate around itself. That kind of sustained self-management is its own form of labor, invisible to most people but quietly exhausting in ways that occasionally find their way to the surface. Some researchers and observers who study the intersection of celebrity life, aging, and long-term psychological pressure have noted that extreme public careers tend to produce a particular kind of visible weariness over time. Not necessarily sadness, not illness necessarily, but a specific quality that appears in the face of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time. The face, in the end, tells the story that the voice has been trained to hold back. And there is Nicole Kidman's own career to consider, which has remained one of the most visible and continuously active in global entertainment across the same period. Being in a partnership with someone at that level of public life, while simultaneously sustaining your own enormous career alongside it, creates a particular kind of relational pressure. Not destructive pressure, not necessarily, but a persistent weight that requires constant navigation. When people who love Keith Urban look at recent images and feel something unnamed and uncomfortable, they may be responding to all of this at once, not to a single event or a single change, but to the slow and honest accumulation of a life that has been lived at full intensity for a very long time, without many places to rest. At a certain point, the conversation began to take on a different quality. It moved beyond the quick reactions of social media and into something more deliberate. Journalists wrote considered pieces. People with long-form platforms offered careful analysis. Medical professionals, speaking in general terms and without any personal access to Keith Urban or his health history, offered frameworks for thinking about what visible changes in public figures over time might and might not indicate. Some focused on the physical mechanics of touring life and its effects on the body. Weight fluctuations in performers, they noted, are often directly tied to the irregular rhythms of life on the road. The body loses mass during demanding periods and may not fully recover during the brief windows of rest that exist between major commitments. When this pattern repeats across many years, the cumulative effect on someone's appearance can be significant and visible in ways that are easy to misread without that context. Others suggested that what people were observing was the natural acceleration of aging that tends to accompany intense public careers. The specific combination of prolonged UV exposure from performance lighting, chronic disruption of sleep patterns, sustained low-level stress, and the relentless physical demands of live performance can age someone more visibly than a quieter and more private life would. This is not a medical condition. It is simply the honest cost of a particular kind of life, written plainly in the face of the person who lived it. But there were also more careful voices. People who noticed that certain aspects of the visible change seemed less consistent with ordinary aging or weight fluctuation, and more suggestive of other possibilities. Who raised, gently and without drawing conclusions, the idea that there might be health factors involved that had not yet been made part of any public conversation. No official statement has addressed any of this directly. No diagnosis has been confirmed. No conclusion can honestly be drawn from photographs and public appearances alone, and it would be wrong to pretend otherwise. What can be said, clearly and honestly, is that the people who have watched Keith Urban's face across decades of performance, who know its particular qualities almost intuitively at this point, perceived something real. And that perception generated enough genuine concern to sustain a conversation that has not yet reached any resolution, and may not for some time. There is a particular kind of discomfort in caring deeply about someone you have never actually met and never will. Fans exist in a genuinely strange emotional position. They have given real years of real attention and real feeling to an artist, and they have received something real in return. Music and honesty and the particular comfort of a voice that feels familiar. But they have never been part of that person's actual life. They have no way to ask how someone is doing, no way to receive reassurance that things are all right. No way to do anything at all except continue watching and wondering and holding a concern that has no clear place to go. This is where Keith Urban's audience finds itself now. Because the truth, the honest and simple truth, is that nobody outside his immediate circle of family and close friends actually knows what is happening. The changes that people have noticed are real. They have been documented and compared and discussed with enough seriousness that dismissing them as noise would itself be a form of dishonesty. But the explanation for those changes is private. It belongs to him. His health, his choices about his own body, the interior landscape of his emotional life. These are his, and they remain his, regardless of how visible he has chosen to be in other ways. Even people who have spent decades in the public eye are entitled to that privacy, especially then, perhaps. What makes this particular conversation worth having carefully is what it reveals about something larger than Keith Urban himself. He built his entire career on a kind of emotional openness that is genuinely rare. He shared his struggles when sharing them was uncomfortable. He showed up as something close to his full self, consistently, across a very long span of time. And in doing that, he created an audience that doesn't experience him as a distant, famous person. They experience him as someone they know in the real and felt sense of that word, even if the knowing only flows in one direction. That kind of investment is not trivial. It is not mere fandom. It is the natural and human consequence of a career spent connecting honestly with people rather than performing a carefully managed version of yourself from behind a safe distance. His body of work, the albums and the live recordings and the performances that exist now as a permanent record, speaks clearly about the kind of artist he has always been. Someone who never seemed to take any of it for granted. Someone who understood from early on what the music required of him and kept offering it, not because the industry demanded it, but because the music itself did. Whatever is happening now exists inside the full context of that life. A life built on commitment and honesty and a willingness to be genuinely seen, even when being seen is not always comfortable. There is a version of this story that is nothing more than gossip dressed in concerned language. That version reduces a real person to a series of comparison photographs and traffics in speculation without accountability. This is not that version, and it was never meant to be. The concern that people feel when they look at Keith Urban now and notice something different is a legitimate and human response to someone they have genuinely come to care about over a long period of time. It deserves to be held carefully, examined honestly, and expressed without cruelty. Because at the center of all of this is a real person, one who has offered himself to the world with unusual generosity for a very long time, and who is, like every one of us, moving through time in ways that are not entirely within his control or anyone else's. Aging is not a failure. Change is not an alarm. The human face, especially one that has been as openly and honestly offered to the public as Keith Urban's has been, is not a fixed or permanent thing. It moves with the life being lived behind it. It responds to what that life costs. And sometimes the changes it shows are not problems in need of solving, but simply the honest evidence of a full and complicated existence. One that has contained more than most people will ever be asked to carry. What remains through all of it is the music. The catalog he built across 2 decades is not diminished by any photograph. The performances captured on film don't become smaller because of a changed jawline or a new quality in his eyes. If anything, understanding something of what it cost to produce that body of work makes it feel more significant, not less. More earned, more real. The hope held quietly and without drama is simply that Keith Urban is well. That whatever the visible change reflects, it is being met with the same honesty and courage he has brought to every difficult thing his life has asked of him. That the people who are close to him are taking care of him in the ways that matter. That he is taking care of himself. And that if and when he has something he wants to share with the world about any of this, he will share it in his own time and in his own words. The way he has always done things from the very beginning. Until then, the music plays on. The concern among those who love him remains real and human and worth naming. And the story, like all stories that belong to real people living real lives, continues without a clean or convenient ending. If something in this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what it means to watch someone you care about change from a distance, or about what we genuinely owe to the artists who have given so much of themselves to us over the years, leave a comment below. This is exactly the kind of conversation worth having, carefully and honestly, and with real respect for the person at the center of it. If you want more stories told this way, with depth and care and full attention to what actually matters, subscribe. There are more of them coming, and they will always be told the only way that feels right.